There is a photograph taken in the 1860s of a building in San Francisco. The structure is elegant, multi-storied, built with a precision that would challenge modern construction teams. But look at the base of the building. The ground floor windows, the ones that should sit at street level, are buried. Not partially obscured. Not weathered down. Buried. Submerged beneath the earth, as though the street itself rose up around them, swallowing the lower third of the structure whole. This photograph is not an anomaly. Across North America, across Europe, across Central Asia and deep into South America, there are thousands of structures documented, photographed, still standing today, where the ground floors are underground, where staircases descend to what should be the entrance level, where basement windows open onto what was once open air, where entire commercial floors operate beneath the current street grade, accessible only by going down. The official explanation is simple. Cities were built on swampy ground. Drainage was poor. Roads were raised for sanitation purposes. Buildings were lifted or modified over time. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth examining too closely. But the official explanation has a problem. Several problems, actually. And once you begin to genuinely look at the physical record, the architectural anomalies, the photographic evidence from the mid-1800s, the peculiar orphan populations that appeared across multiple continents in the same narrow window of time, and the strange silence in the official historical record around a specific 30 to 50-year period, a different picture begins to emerge. Not the picture of gradual urban development. Not the picture of incremental sanitation improvements and voluntary road raising programs. Something else. Something that happened faster than any official timeline admits. Something that left entire cities partially submerged. Something that the institutions tasked with explaining history have never fully explained. This is the story of what may lie beneath your feet. Beneath the streets you walk every day. Beneath cities that were not, perhaps, built by the civilization that currently occupies them. This is the story of the mud flood. To understand what we are looking at, we have to start with what we can physically verify. Not theory. Not speculation. Physical structures you can visit today. In Chicago, Illinois, the entire downtown district sits on a raised platform. In the 1850s and 1860s, the city undertook what historians describe as one of the most ambitious civil engineering projects in American history: the raising of the entire city. Buildings were lifted using jack screws. Streets were elevated. The infrastructure of the downtown core was essentially rebuilt upward by several feet. The official reason given is drainage. Chicago was built on low, swampy ground near Lake Michigan, and without proper elevation, sewage could not flow away from the city. So the city was raised. This explanation is accepted without much scrutiny. But consider what that explanation actually requires you to believe. That a mid-19th century city, using technology that was barely a generation removed from horse-drawn plows and hand tools, undertook a citywide elevation project of staggering engineering complexity and did so in a matter of years. That they raised entire city blocks, including occupied buildings, without major incident. That they did this simultaneously with managing a rapidly exploding population, building new infrastructure, and running normal commercial life. And that this happened not just in Chicago. It happened in cities across the continent. Sacramento, California was raised. Portland, Oregon was raised. Seattle, Washington was raised so dramatically that its original street level is now an underground network of tunnels and storefronts known as the Seattle Underground, a tourist attraction where visitors walk through what used to be the ground floor of the city's buildings, now sealed beneath the current street grade. Seattle Underground is not a small curiosity. It is an entire district. Entire city blocks. Entire commercial streets with storefronts, sidewalks, and signage, preserved beneath the surface of the modern city. The official explanation for Seattle is a fire in 1889 that destroyed the original wooden downtown, after which the city was rebuilt with the streets elevated to prevent flooding. A single fire. And the solution was to bury the entire original street level and build on top of it. There is something in that explanation that moves too quickly past the scale of what is being described. Now step back further. Step back to the photographic record. The daguerreotype and early wetplate photography of the mid-19th century gives us something extraordinary, a visual record of major cities at the moment they were allegedly being built. And what those photographs show is deeply inconsistent with the official developmental narrative. Photographs of St. Louis in the 1850s show a dense, sophisticated cityscape. Stone buildings of 5, 6, 7 stories. Elaborate cornices. Arched windows with detailed stonework. Cast iron facades. Not the primitive frontier buildings you would expect from a young nation still technically in the early stages of industrialization. But what is more striking than the sophistication of the architecture is where those buildings sit in relation to the ground. Look at the lower portions of those structures in the early photographs. Then look at photographs of the same buildings taken 20, 30 years later. The ground line has changed. The lower windows, visible in the earlier photographs as ground-level features, are lower in the later photographs. Sometimes partially obscured. Sometimes entirely below grade. And the buildings have not been rebuilt. The same stones. The same cornices. The same architectural details. Just buried deeper as time progresses. This pattern repeats in New York. In Philadelphia. In Cincinnati. In dozens of European cities as well, in Prague, in Budapest, in Strasbourg, in cities across Russia and the former Ottoman territories. In St. Petersburg, Russia, there are buildings where the documented original ground floor is now several feet beneath the current street. In some areas of the old city, the difference between the original architectural floor line and the current street grade is so pronounced that basement-level windows that were clearly designed to be at street level given their size and placement now look out onto buried earth. These are not buildings that were poorly designed. These are not buildings where the architect accidentally put the grand entrance 6 feet below grade. These are buildings where the grade changed. Where the ground rose. And it rose across multiple continents at roughly the same time. The question of timing is where this investigation becomes genuinely disturbing. If we look at the historical record for North American and European cities, something strange happens in the period roughly spanning 1800 to 1870. The cities that exist at the end of that period are, in many cases, architecturally far more sophisticated than the cities that supposedly existed at the beginning. But more significantly, the record of how those cities were built is oddly thin. There are records of cities existing. There are records of populations growing. There are administrative documents, property records, commercial registers. But the records of construction, the detailed accounts of how the massive stone buildings of 19th-century urban centers were actually built are sparse in ways that should prompt more scholarly attention than they typically receive. The architectural sophistication of mid-19th century buildings in cities like Cincinnati or Philadelphia is, by any honest engineering analysis, remarkable. The precision stonework. The large-scale masonry. The load distribution in multi-story stone structures. The hydraulic systems built into some of these buildings. These are not the outputs of a construction culture in its first or second generation. These are the outputs of a highly developed, deeply experienced building tradition. And yet the historical narrative asks us to believe that these cities grew from small frontier settlements to architectural masterworks within 2 or 3 generations of people who had, in many cases, only recently arrived from Europe. People who were simultaneously clearing land, farming, fighting wars, building roads, and managing the social chaos of rapid migration. The gap between the narrative and the physical evidence is one that historians typically bridge with vague references to rapid development and entrepreneurial spirit. These are phrases that explain nothing while sounding like they explain everything. What if the more honest explanation is simpler? What if those buildings were not built by the civilization that found them? This is the central claim of what researchers and independent historians have come to call the mud flood hypothesis, and it is important to be precise about what that hypothesis actually states, because it is frequently misrepresented. The mud flood hypothesis does not claim that aliens built ancient cities. It does not require supernatural explanations. It proposes something far more disturbing precisely because it requires only natural processes and human deception to function. The hypothesis holds that sometime in the relatively recent past, within the last 3 to 5 centuries, and possibly as recently as the early 1800s, a large-scale geological or atmospheric event caused significant sediment displacement across wide regions of the globe. This event, whether it was a series of floods, a geomagnetic event that destabilized surface materials, a comet impact, or some other catastrophic mechanism, deposited enormous quantities of mud, silt, and debris across populated areas. Not everywhere uniformly. Not in a single wave. But in patterns consistent with what we observe in the photographic and architectural record. Buildings were partially buried. Lower floors were submerged. Street levels rose. And the civilizations that had built or occupied those structures were either destroyed, displaced, or so severely disrupted that when the historical record resumes when populations recovered and institutions reformed, what they found was a landscape of partially buried structures whose origins they either genuinely did not know, or chose not to record honestly. The architecture was repurposed. The buried floors were either excavated and reused, or sealed off and built over. The historical record was written in a way that attributed these structures to the current civilization, either out of genuine confusion or deliberate institutional interest. That second possibility, deliberate institutional interest, is where the hypothesis becomes something more than geological speculation. Let us talk about orphans. In the period between approximately 1840 and 1880, something extraordinary and largely unexamined happened across North America and Europe. Orphanages appeared at a scale that has never been fully explained by demographic historians. Not small charitable institutions. Industrial-scale orphanages. State-funded orphan trains in the United States carried hundreds of thousands of children, documented at around 250,000 by conservative estimates, from the cities of the East Coast to farming communities across the Midwest and West. The official narrative of the orphan trains frames them as a humanitarian response to urban poverty. Industrialization had created dangerous, overcrowded cities. Poor families were unable to care for their children. Charitable organizations stepped in to relocate children to better environments. This explanation is not wrong. But it is incomplete in a way that deserves scrutiny. Where did the parents of these children go? Not where did they move. Where did they go? Because in many documented cases, the orphans carried by these trains were not children of known parents who had surrendered them. They were children with no traceable family background. No documented origin. No record of where they had come from before they appeared in the cities. The founder of the Children's Aid Society, Charles Loring Brace, who organized the largest of the orphan train programs, wrote extensively about the children he was processing. His language in those writings is curious. He repeatedly describes children who seemed to have no past. Children who could not account for themselves. Children who appeared to have simply materialized in the urban environment without parents, without relatives, without community ties, without any connective tissue to the world before them. Brace attributed this to the chaos of immigration and urban poverty. That is a reasonable attribution. But it is worth noting what it would also look like if a significant portion of a previous population had been suddenly removed from the record. If families had been destroyed or displaced by an event that the institutional apparatus of the mid-19th century was not willing or not able to document honestly. The orphan populations of this period are not proof of a catastrophe. But they are consistent with one. And consistency, in the absence of contradicting evidence, is something a serious investigator must take seriously. There is a specific event in American history that sits at the center of this inquiry like a stone that has been deliberately left unturned. The World's Columbian Exposition. Chicago. 1893. The exposition was built on the south side of Chicago at a site called Jackson Park. What was constructed there in the space of approximately 2 years was, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated architectural complexes in the history of North American construction. The White City, as it was called, comprised more than 200 buildings in the neoclassical style. Enormous. Precise. Built with a perfection of proportion and detail that architects of the period openly described as surpassing anything being built at the time. The official story is that these buildings were constructed specifically for the exposition, built from a material called staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris, cement, and jute fiber, and then deliberately demolished after the event concluded. A temporary city. Built and destroyed. But people who attended the exposition did not describe it as looking temporary. Visitors in the tens of millions traveled from around the world and wrote extensively about the experience. Their accounts consistently describe a city that felt ancient. That felt permanent. That felt as though it had existed long before they arrived. Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed the landscape of the exposition, described the planning process in his letters. His descriptions of the site before construction are strange. He refers to existing features of the landscape that he was working with, rather than creating from scratch. He refers to decisions made in response to what was already there. Several of the buildings at the 1893 exposition were documented with lower floors, basement levels that could not have been newly constructed if the site had been, as officially claimed, undeveloped marshland before the exposition. Basement levels imply excavation. Excavation at that scale on a former marshland site would have been a documented engineering challenge of the first order. The documentation is not there. After the exposition closed, a fire of suspicious origin destroyed much of the White City. The buildings that survived were demolished in subsequent years. The demolition contracts were awarded quickly. The material was removed efficiently. The site was cleared and converted to parkland. A city built, celebrated by the world, and then erased. Quickly. Completely. Officially to return the land to public park use. Or, if another interpretation is possible, a city that had already existed, that was briefly repurposed for public presentation, and that was then sealed away again before questions about its actual origin could be organized into a coherent challenge to the official narrative. Now let us talk about the architecture itself with more precision. The buildings that were photographed at the 1893 exposition and that appear in the thousands of existing photographic records from the event display construction characteristics that are inconsistent with the stated building methods and timeline. Staff, the material officially used in the construction, was a relatively new compound that had been used experimentally in Paris at earlier exhibitions. It was applied to wooden or metal frameworks to create the appearance of stone construction. This is documented and verifiable. But the photographic record of the exposition buildings shows, in specific cases, construction details that are inconsistent with staff application to lightweight frameworks. Photographic analysis by independent researchers has identified what appear to be structural joints, load-bearing transitions, and weathering patterns in certain buildings that suggest actual masonry rather than surface-applied staff. This is not a conclusive argument. Photographs from that era are limited in resolution and depth. Staff construction could, in specific conditions, produce weathering effects that superficially resemble masonry. But combined with everything else, the timeline, the basement levels, the eyewitness accounts of the building's permanence and apparent age, the speed of the post-exposition demolition, and the absence of detailed construction records, it forms a pattern that is difficult to dismiss with a comfortable wave toward staff application techniques. And the 1893 exposition is only the most visible, most documented, and most studied example of something that appears repeatedly throughout the 19th century World's Fair movement. Paris 1867. Vienna 1873. Philadelphia 1876. Paris again in 1889, where the Eiffel Tower was built as a temporary structure and, unlike everything around it, was not demolished. These events, staged at intervals across the major cities of the Western world, all shared the same fundamental structure. Magnificent architectural complexes appeared, were celebrated, and were then erased. The pattern of creation and erasure. The pattern of presentation and removal. This is not the behavior of civilizations building their own cities. This is the behavior of civilizations managing a landscape of existing structures whose origins required explanation or whose origins required concealment. In Russia, the evidence takes a different form. And in some ways, it is more difficult to dismiss because it involves administrative records rather than architectural inference. In the reign of Peter the Great and the decades following, the Russian imperial bureaucracy undertook a systematic reorganization of historical records across the territories of what would become the Russian Empire. Monasteries that had held documents for centuries were subjected to imperial audits. Archives were centralized. Records were transferred to state institutions where access was controlled. Historians have long noted that this period of record centralization in Russia resulted in significant gaps in the pre-Petrine historical record. Documents that were known to exist from secondary references referenced in other documents, mentioned in correspondence, listed in archive inventories are simply absent from the post-Petrine institutional collections. The official explanation is that records were lost in the chaos of consolidation. That documents deteriorated. That monasteries did not maintain their holdings carefully. But there is a specific category of missing record that deserves attention: the records relating to the population of Siberia and Central Russia in the early to mid-17th century. Siberian towns that appear in the administrative record of the mid-17th century as established, functioning settlements with populations, taxation records, and commercial activity have very thin documentation for how those settlements came into existence in the preceding generations. The buildings in several of these Siberian towns photographed in the late 19th and early 20th century before modernization erased them showed the same ground burial characteristics visible in North American and European cities. Lower floors partially submerged. Grand architectural details appearing beneath the current grade. Entrance staircases descending rather than rising. Siberia. In the 17th century. Showing the same architectural anomalies as Chicago, Seattle, and Prague. If these were all the products of independent poor drainage decisions by independent municipal authorities across thousands of miles and multiple continents, working within different administrative systems, different architectural traditions, and different climatic conditions, then we are being asked to accept an extraordinary coincidence. Or we are being asked not to look too carefully at all. There is a category of researcher who is dismissed most quickly in conversations about these anomalies: the one who simply goes down into the Seattle underground, into the basement levels of the buildings in Old Montreal where the original ground floor is sealed beneath the current street, into the sub-street infrastructure of cities like Edinburgh, where the South Bridge vaults represent an entire urban neighborhood that was built over, not demolished, just sealed at street level and forgotten, leaving complete rooms, corridors, and spaces intact beneath the current city. The Edinburgh South Bridge vaults are instructive. They were built in the late 18th century as part of a bridge structure that carried the road over a valley. The arches beneath the bridge were incorporated into the structure as chambers officially used for storage and workshop space. But within a generation of their construction, they were sealed off. The official reason given is that they were damp and difficult to maintain. But people were living in them. Documentary records from the early 19th century describe significant populations occupying the vault spaces, not just workers storing equipment, but families. Entire communities. And then, in the early to mid-19th century, those populations vanished from the records, and the vaults were sealed. The vaults were rediscovered in 1985 when a sports center being built nearby broke through a wall. What was found inside was not an emptied storage space. What was found were rooms with the contents of former habitation still present. Objects left in place. The material signature of lives that ended abruptly rather than communities that relocated. The official position is that the populations moved to better housing as the city improved. That the objects left behind were simply abandoned goods not worth taking. That the sealing of the vaults was administrative rather than traumatic. Perhaps the mundane explanation is correct. But what is the mundane explanation doing in Edinburgh and Seattle and Chicago and St. Petersburg and Siberian Russia all at once, all within the same century, all leaving the same signature of rapidly covered, rapidly abandoned, partially buried architecture? Let us bring this forward to something that can be physically measured. Sediment accumulation rates are studied by geologists with considerable precision. In normal conditions, in stable environments without major flood events, sediment accumulates at a rate of approximately 1 to 2 millimeters per year. Over the course of a century, that represents 4 to 8 inches of natural accumulation. The burial depths we are examining in these cities are not 4 to 8 inches. In Seattle, the original street level is 12 to 35 feet below the current grade in some areas. In Chicago, the elevation was raised between 4 and 14 feet. In Sacramento, the entire downtown grid was raised by 10 to 15 feet. Even accounting for deliberate fill material placed during documented elevation projects, the scale of burial in many cases exceeds what could be explained by the documented projects alone. And in the cases where no official elevation project is recorded, where the burial depth exists without any documented explanation, the standard sediment accumulation rate makes the depth physically impossible within the conventional historical timeline. Something else contributed to the burial. Something faster than normal sediment accumulation. Something that moved material in volumes and at speeds inconsistent with gradual urban development. The geological term for rapid, large-scale sediment deposition is catastrophic alluvial deposit. It is the material signature of floods, of large-scale atmospheric events, of the kind of geological disruption that, in the prehistoric record, is associated with the end of previous civilizations. The difference is that in the prehistoric record, we accept catastrophic geological events as the explanation for the disappearance of previous peoples. In the historical record, in the period covered by documentation, by institutional memory, by the official narrative of Western civilization, we are not supposed to ask the same questions. The evidence does not seem to care about that distinction. Who benefits from the concealment if concealment is what occurred? This is the question that every serious investigation must eventually ask. Not because malice is always the explanation for historical gaps, but because institutional behavior follows incentives, and understanding the incentives illuminates the record. Consider what would be implied by an honest accounting of the mud flood hypothesis, if it is substantially correct. Consider what it would mean if the architecture of major 19th century cities was not built by those cities' founding populations. If the sophisticated stone buildings, the precision-engineered infrastructure, the hydraulic systems and load-bearing designs and architectural proportions that characterize the great buildings of the 19th century, if those were the products of a previous civilization, one that was ended or severely disrupted by a catastrophic event, and if the current civilization simply inherited and repurposed that architecture, it would mean that the foundational narrative of Western civilization, the narrative of advancement from primitive beginnings to sophisticated modernity, the narrative of progress from log cabins to stone cities, the narrative of industrial achievement and frontier ingenuity would be, at minimum, incomplete. At maximum, it would be a story told over the ruins of someone else's world. It would mean that the institutions that control historical narrative, the universities, the governmental archives, the professional archaeological and historical associations, have either failed to notice something extraordinary that is visible in the photographic record, the architectural record, and the geological record simultaneously, or they have chosen not to bring that something to public attention. Neither of those possibilities is comforting. One suggests an incompetence so profound it strains credulity. The other suggests a concealment so sustained it would represent one of the largest coordinated institutional suppressions in human history. The question of which possibility is more likely is one that each person must answer for themselves. But the question should be asked. It should be asked loudly. And the evidence upon which it rests should be examined with the seriousness it deserves. In 2019, a researcher documenting architectural anomalies in Central Asian cities photographed a series of buildings in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. Samarkand is an ancient city, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Central Asia, with a history stretching back more than 2 millennia. Its architectural heritage is world-renowned. Its great mosques and madrasas are UNESCO World Heritage Sites visited by hundreds of thousands of people annually. The researcher photographed, in the older residential districts away from the famous monuments, a series of ordinary buildings, not grand structures, not historically significant architecture, just the ordinary fabric of a pre-modern city. And in those buildings, the same signature appeared that appears in Chicago and Seattle and St. Petersburg and Edinburgh. Ground floor windows buried. Lower architectural registers submerged below the current grade. Staircases descending to what should be ground level but now opens onto a floor below the street. In a city whose continuous occupation stretches back 2,000 years. In a city that has survived conquests, earthquakes, Silk Road commerce, and the passage of armies. In a city that has never, according to its official history, undergone the kind of radical urban engineering that Chicago or Sacramento undertook in the 19th century. The mud is there too. In Samarkand, the sediment has simply been there longer. Has had more time to be normalized, incorporated, built over, forgotten. And if it is there in Samarkand, if the same signature of rapid sediment burial appears in a Central Asian city with no 19th century American-style urban engineering program, then the localized explanations begin to fail. The drainage argument fails. The municipal elevation argument fails. The poor planning argument fails. What does not fail, when the evidence is assembled honestly, is the idea that something happened to this planet. Something that moved material across vast distances in a short period of time. Something that buried the lower portions of existing structures across multiple continents. Something that disrupted populations severely enough to produce the orphan crisis, the record gaps, the institutional silence, and the architectural anomalies that remain visible today for anyone willing to look at them. The last thing to examine is not a building or a photograph or a sediment core. It is a silence. In the professional literature of architectural history, urban planning history, and historical geology, the mud flood hypothesis is not addressed. It is not refuted with counter-evidence. It is not dismantled with superior analysis. It is not acknowledged as a question worth engaging. It is simply absent from the conversation. This is unusual. Fringe theories in other domains, alternative explanations for the construction of the pyramids, theories about Atlantis, hypotheses about pre-Columbian contact are regularly addressed in academic literature, sometimes at length. They are examined, criticized, and placed within the broader context of existing scholarship. The act of refutation itself produces a documentary record of the theory's existence and the seriousness with which it was engaged. The mud flood hypothesis has no such record in the professional literature. It exists in the conversations of independent researchers, in YouTube documentaries and online forums, in the careful photographic analyses of people with no institutional affiliation and therefore no institutional protection. And it is met, from the official historical apparatus, with silence. Silence is not proof of a conspiracy. Silence can be indifference. It can be the natural result of a professional culture that dismisses non-credentialed inquiry without examination. But silence, when the physical evidence is as extensive and as cross-cultural and as measurable as what we have examined here, is itself a data point. It tells you something about the institutional priorities of the bodies that control historical narrative. It tells you something about what questions those institutions are not, for whatever reason, willing to formally engage. And it leaves the rest of us standing above ground, walking streets that were once lower, passing buildings whose lower floors are sealed in the dark beneath us, carrying a history that may be far shorter and far more violent and far less certain than we have been told. The photograph from San Francisco in the 1860s is still there. You can find it. You can look at it and see the buried windows and the rising ground line and the building that has not moved while the earth around it climbed. You can walk into the Seattle underground and stand in what used to be open air on a street where people walked and traded and lived their ordinary lives. You can stand in the Edinburgh vaults and feel the weight of the city above you pressing down on the sealed chambers where communities once existed and then simply stopped existing in the official record. You can look at the orphan train numbers and the missing Russian archives and the extraordinary sophistication of mid-19th century American stone architecture, and you can ask yourself whether the timeline you were given in school is the only timeline that fits the evidence. The cities are still here. Partially. The parts above ground are well documented. The parts below ground are largely unexamined, inaccessible, sealed away from systematic inquiry. In cities across the world, there are sealed substreet levels. Sealed and locked. Not excavated. Not analyzed. Not incorporated into the official architectural record of those cities. Just sealed. The reasoning given for the sealing varies by city, but the pattern of the sealing does not vary. It is consistent. It is global. And it is maintained. What is beneath you right now, wherever you are reading this, is not just soil and pipes and the ordinary infrastructure of modern life. In certain cities, in certain streets, in certain blocks where the ground line does not quite match the architecture, what is beneath you is a floor. A sealed room. A staircase descending to an entrance that was once at street level. A window looking out onto buried earth from a room that was once full of light. Those rooms are still there. Waiting in the dark. Beneath the streets of a civilization that either does not know what it is standing on, or has decided, for reasons it has never publicly articulated, that the rest of us should not be told. The record has always been there for those willing to look below the surface. The question is not whether the evidence exists. The question is who decides which evidence gets examined, who funds the excavations, who controls the archives, and who benefits from a history that begins conveniently above the mud line. If this investigation has unsettled something in you, if it has made the ground beneath your feet feel slightly less certain, then you understand exactly what archaeology, done honestly, is supposed to feel like. The buried cities are waiting. They have been waiting for a very long time. And somewhere, in an archive that is not open to the public, in a sealed basement that has not been listed in any official inventory, in a government-controlled collection of 19th century photographs that has never been digitized and placed online, the full record may still exist. The question is whether anyone with the authority to open those doors will ever choose to do so. Or whether the mud, in all its forms, will simply be left to hold its silence. If what lies beneath these streets matters to you, if the hidden record of this world is something you believe deserves examination, stay with this inquiry. Because the evidence is not finished revealing itself. And neither are we.